Recording on. Here you go. So why don't we begin? We're all here. Great to see everybody. Let me do this first. Okay. This is the calendar that we sent out at the beginning of the year, and we've kept pretty much true to it. We've, considering how often in the Jewish world we change dates, or we have to cancel things. I mean, think of the old days when we had weather-related cancellations. That may not even happen this winter, but there will be one that isn't going to take place. So anyway, we're in December now. We've had 6 of these sessions, and this is the 7th one. And the next one is scheduled for next Tuesday, December 21st. So I'm showing this to you because we are going to be canceling that session. The reason is that we are hosting, Temple Beth El is hosting the community-wide memorial service for the homeless, which is done every year right around the holidays. But we've never hosted it before, and I'm really glad we are. This is an interfaith council event, and anyway, it will be both in person and online at this point. That's, always subject to change these days, but we are definitely going to be streaming it. So anyway, I recommend that you see it. It's at 6 next Tuesday, but since it's live, and since I can't predict how long it's going to go, and since it's too confusing to change times, we're going to cancel next week. So the next session then is January 4th. We're going to go into 2022 as we continue. And we're sort of at a different place now. We had these 5 introductory sessions. We had first an introduction to the class and the book. And then we had 5 that were trying to thematically cover the scope of the New Jewish Canon. That was ending last time. And now I'm going to sort of pick and choose. I'm going to cherry pick some books that I feel are most important for us to discuss. And tonight, one might say, is the class we've all been waiting for, at least some have, because you can see even in the blurb advertising the course, the first book I mentioned is Harold Kushner's When Bad Things Happen to Good People. So how could we have gone much farther with this class without getting to that book? I mean, it would be false advertising. And so tonight we are going to talk about that perhaps most read book other than the Bible that's been written by a rabbi. And remember, the New Testament was written by apostles. So I think we're on solid ground there. In terms of bestsellers, nothing beats When Bad Things Happen to Good People. So we're going to talk about that tonight. Anyway, and then so the next session will be January 4th. Another reason I'm mentioning this is that if you happen to have the book, and I hope you do, and you have had a chance to read ahead or just to look at things, or even if you know the table of contents and there's this particular book that you remember having heard about or studied back in the day, and you want to make sure we cover it, please let me know. Because there's this class is right now sort of in the improvisational stage, which doesn't mean that there won't be structure. There's always structure, but that there's a lot of input on your part, a lot of opportunity for input. So, for instance, had we not been covering When Bad Things Happen to Good People, I can be sure that someone would have said, aren't we going to talk about Harold Kushner's book? So that's what we're going to talk about tonight. But in the essay where this book appears, another book actually appears in the same essay, which is really interesting. And I also threw in a couple of other essays, a couple of other books that are important, and we may not get to both of them. We may not get to all of them tonight. That's okay. We do that from time to time. Better to overshoot than undershoot, as leave them wanting more. So first question I have is, have you read When Bad Things Happen to Good People? I'm giving it such a build-up. All right, I see heads nodding. I'm on gallery view, so I can see basically all the heads that aren't dogs. And Anyway, so most of you have read it.
You read
So
it
my
all?
second question will be, if you haven't read it, why? All right, let me put it in another way that's a little more tactful. When did
I've
you
read it.
read it? If you read this book, when did it come in handy for you?
Ooh.
Susan, did you have your hand up?
Well, not to answer that question, but
Okay, well, what's
but
your
just to say
question?
that I've read it. Um, I don't know. I read it was a long time ago,
Well, I bet
and
it was at a time when you were going through something and
yeah,
experiencing suffering
yes,
in
and
one way or another,
in one
or,
way or another.
misfortune. Yeah.
Um, Actually, I think it was more at a time when I was just exploring these questions. I don't think there was a personal need for the book at the time, other than as an intellectual pursuit,
It's more of a
believe it or not.
detached philosophical questioning.
Yeah, it was one of those things that, others were going through things, and I found it an interesting read.
This book came out in 1981.
Yeah.
By the way, did anyone else want to share, when you came across it or what this book has meant to you? Okay, but feel free, if because I think this book has meant a lot to a lot of people. Came out in the early 80s. I was in rabbinical school at the time, and I can tell you that it was a sensation. It was, it really just shook everything within the rabbinical school community that I was part of. For one thing, Harold Kushner, the author, was a conservative rabbi. He's still alive, thank God. He is a conservative rabbi of great renown. Even before this book obviously put him in a different stratosphere, but even before then, he was very much from the mainstream of the movement. He was the establishment in a lot of ways. Suburban synagogue, Natick, Massachusetts, a neighboring community to mine, so I actually got to know him fairly well while I was growing up. Of course, he was of a different generation, but I knew his kids from Camp Ramah. One of them, at least, was a camper. We're in a place where, in an ADA, in a unit division where I was a counselor and then division head. So I got to know the family a little through that. And of course, I'd heard about the tragedy of his son, Aaron, through that very rare disease, who died so tragically young. And so Harold Kushner was a known entity. But when he wrote this, and by the way, he'd written other books. He'd written When Children Ask About God, How to Tell Your Child About Death. Very sort of important, pragmatic, mainstream type books that a rabbi would write. Most of his writing was, I think, Jewish Publication Society, very small publisher. And suddenly he wrote this book with the same expectations that his other books. I'm sure the publisher figured, okay, I'll print a couple of hundred, couple of thousand copies. He's pretty well known. And it was on the New York Times bestseller list for weeks and weeks and months, and I swear, I think years. And that's why I say it was the best-selling book, other than the Bible, written by a rabbi. It was a phenomenon. It tapped something within the culture. It was reviewed by Christian periodicals, and transcended boundaries of Jewish communities, which is really fascinating because books by rabbis had not done that until then, certainly not to this degree. And so, in that sense, it was a radical shift. And the question he was trying to answer is the eternal question. It wasn't a new question by any means. Why do bad things happen to good people? The perfect title, because it's a question all of us ask at one point or another, usually about ourselves. Why is this happening to me? So it hit home for everyone, and not just in a Jewish way. It went beyond the boundaries of peoplehood. Remember, we've talked a lot about Jewish peoplehood and some of the works of the last half century. Israel, Soviet Jewry, intermarriage is one book that we have tonight that's sort of about intermarriage too. Jewish identity. This is a whole different animal. This is going and intentionally beyond the Jewish community to a world that non-Jews can also understand, to a very human side of who we are, to a universal side. So it's reaching out. And this kind of outreach became a model for many, many books to follow. Of course, it makes a lot of sense. There are a lot more Christians to buy books than Jews. So in a very practical way, if you want to sell a lot of books, you want to reach beyond the Jewish community. But it made sense in how the whole country, it sort of hit the zeitgeist. This question. So what was going on in the early 1980s where this question would suddenly become even more important? And, the book of Job has been around for a long time. This really took the book of Job and updated it. He talks a lot about Job in the book. So what was going on in the early 80s, in the 1980s? And you could probably answer a lot. There are a lot of good answers to that, but anyone want to throw something into the chat or just answer? Anybody? Does anyone remember that far back? AIDS. I think that's sort of the most natural answer. Although 1981, when this book came out, may not have been a time where AIDS was, yet a focus. But remember, weeks, months, years on the best side, it's still selling well. It's timeless in that regard. But AIDS definitely forced people to ask that question. Why is God doing this? Is God punishing those who are getting AIDS? And most of us could not accept the answer to that as yes. Some could, evangelicals especially, but most could not. And so we had to struggle with that question. Well, what is God's role in suffering then? Susan, you have your hand up?
No.
No, okay.
I yelled
out. That was
out.
for the answer. I got
that
it.
Was for my answer.
All right. Lower your hand. I will do it. There you go. Okay.
Thank you.
So bad things happen to good people. Here's the thing. Not only are we reaching out beyond the boundaries of the Jewish community, but we're reaching inward, turning inward to seeking spiritual meaning in our religion. And we're going to see that in other books that we're talking about tonight. There was definitely, you ever heard the expression, the me generation? Mm-hmm. Remember the New York Magazine had a big article about the me generation. And Saturday Night Live capitalized on it with Al Franken, who said, this is the me generation, me, Al Franken. I don't know if you remember some of their early stuff, but yeah, and that was the mid 70s into the 80s. So we're going from the 60s where the whole world is in revolution to, oh God, we got to just pull back. And people, and it's sort of an extension of the 60s at the same time, because people who had gone to, to communes and ashrams, et cetera, to seek meaning in the East, maybe they're looking for special meaning within. And can Judaism supply that meaning? Well, Harold Kushner is saying, yes, Judaism can definitely supply it in a theological way. But here's the rub. His solution, his answer to the question was very radical. It was so radical that until he came along, you would not hear it at JTS, Jewish Theological Seminary, where I was a rabbinical student. When he came along, his book was thrown into the syllabus, the syllabi for philosophy and theology, because it was legitimized by the fact that millions and millions of people had bought it. And the fact that Harold Kushner is, on appearance, most unassuming, unthreatening, unradical looking, one might say, Parav, type rabbi. I mean, he was, you would, he's the kind of rabbi who would speak at any suburban synagogue on any Shabbat morning or high holiday, and but he was saying something extremely radical that no one really dared to say. What he was saying is that God is not responsible for your suffering. I mean, think about that. So then why be religious? I mean, that brings up a whole set of questions.
What's that?
But he's
I
saying
know.
that God is,
Please, Betty.
sorry,
This
did anyone have a
bird-
question? All right, so God is looking not so much as the perpetrator of the suffering, but that God is the one who comforts us and gives us the capacity to love others who are suffering and to be loved. God is that love. And he sees God as an active agent, but not as the cause
Not
of suffering. Okay? So, anyway, let me share a couple of excerpts. Let's see. So, anyway, this is from the book. So let's just start from the beginning here. There are very few, there's just a couple of paragraphs basically from the book that are found here, but they're illustrative. If a man who knew nothing about medicine were to walk into the operating room of a hospital and see doctors and nurses performing an operation, he might assume that they were a band of criminals torturing their unfortunate victim. He would see them tying the patient down, forcing a cone over his nose and mouth so that he could not breathe, and sticking knives and needles into him. Only someone who understood surgery would realize that they were doing all this to help the patient, not to torment him. So too, it is suggested, God does painful things to us as his way of helping us. Such answers are thought up by people who believe very strongly that God is a loving parent who controls what happens to us, and on the basis of that belief adjust and interpret the facts to fit their assumptions. It may be true that surgeons stick knives into people to help them, but not everyone who sticks a knife into someone else is a surgeon. It may be true that sometimes we have to do painful things to people we love for their benefits, but not every painful thing that happens to us is beneficial. I would find it easier to believe that I experience tragedy and suffering in order to repair that which is faulty in my personality if there were some clear connection between the fault and the punishment. A parent who disciplines a child for doing something wrong but never tells him what he's being punished for is hardly a model for responsible parenthood. Yet those who explain suffering as God's way of teaching us to change are at a loss to specify just what it is about us that we are supposed to change. So, and then he goes into extreme examples of people who suffer, like a child who falls from a window into a swimming pool and dies. Why does God permit such a thing to happen to an innocent child? It can't be to teach a child a lesson about exploring new areas. By the time the lesson is over, the child is dead. Is it to teach parents and babysitters to be more careful? That is too trivial a lesson to be purchased at a price of a child's life. Is it to make the parents more sensitive, more compassionate people, more appreciative of life and health because of their experience? Is it to move them to work for better safety standards and in that way save 100 future lives? The price is still too high, and the reasoning shows too little regard for the value of an individual life. I am offended by those who suggest that God creates, the R word, children, so that those around them will learn compassion and gratitude. Why should God distort someone else's life to such a degree in order to enhance my spiritual sensitivity? So what do you think about Kushner's early thesis here? All right, so let me show you. I wasn't thinking of Kushner, but I wrote almost the same thing. I'm not comparing myself to Kushner. I just want to show you how the context is very much in the zeitgeist. So I wrote about my brother, and this is in, I've shared this article. It was originally 1991. my brother with Fragile X, and he talked about, at that time we used the word retarded, back in the early 90s. And I spoke sort of the same way about my brother. I believed the old saw that having a retarded sibling was really a blessing in disguise, a gift that would make me a better person. Therefore, Mark's purpose on earth was to provide me with cheap sensitivity training.
Wow.
I know that obviously is not the case, but I think the way we glibly account for suffering is a legitimate question that Kushner brought to the fore. And then he brings the Holocaust in. By the way, the whole chapter discusses the Holocaust. And then, as I mentioned, he talks a lot about the book of Job. Have any of you studied the book of Job at all? It might be worth, it's worth studying. It's really good. Jonathan, I see you're nodding.
Yeah. Yeah. Gorgeous.
You want to just say, on one foot, what is the story here? What is sort of what propels the narrative? Oh, you're muted again. Sorry.
It starts off with suffering and all that afflicts him and his family, particularly his family. But then
they all die.
Right. But and then he's trying to deal with it, and the real anguish, I think, is not so much the opening scenes of his loss, but rather the feckless approach of his friends trying to comfort him and say this is God's way, or maybe you did something wrong. I think that's the real nub of it.
Yes, absolutely. So there's a prologue, a main body of the text, and then there's an epilogue. The prologue and epilogue are like cartoons. And yet, because of the epilogue, which basically says he lived happily ever after, it got into the Bible. The middle part is the meat of it, and it involves Job, who's just lost everything because God and Satan had a bet. And I don't know who won in the end, because the bet was that Job, who was so perfect, would not complain. So God takes everything away from him. And over the course of 40 chapters, it's not a short book, most of it poetry, his friends come to him one at a time, each of them giving a more trivial, trite, insensitive answer than the last, using the kinds of arguments that Kushner talks about here that are very commonly used. I mean, when you've suffered, what are the most tasteless, insensitive arguments, or when you've heard people talking about those who are suffering? What are the kind of arguments that, the last thing you want to hear?
God's will.
It's God's will. Which, by the way, is sort of how Job comes out, but Job goes one step farther, which is actually a fairly mature and justifiable response. It's God's will, but we can't understand God's will. We can't know God's ways. At least that's not trying to ascribe some cheap trick here. It's not saying, well, God thought you did something wrong. That's what one of the friends says. God basically is punishing you. We have no idea. You may not even know, but you did something wrong. So just try to search your ways and find out what you did wrong. The answer at the end, with God comes out of the whirlwind to Job is much more, you can't understand my ways. You don't know what the purpose is here. I mean, I think Kushner ultimately rejects that too, because, it comes back to the Holocaust. You can say that because of the Holocaust, there's a state of Israel. And that's very true in many ways. But you can't say that having a Jewish state for the first time in 2,000 years, even that justifies what happened, the suffering that took place. That is so distasteful, such an insult to the victims, who, by the way, are memorialized today. This morning, was the 10th of Tevet, the Jewish fast day that connects to the destruction of the temple, but has been seen as a yahrzeit for Holocaust victims. So this is an appropriate day to be talking about this. All right, so I mean, but there are all kinds of trite things. I know them because I really try never to say them. And it's so hard. Sometimes it just slips out. Like, we will grow from this experience. No, you don't. You don't grow from an experience that is so horrific. It changes us. Even talking about COVID, we could say we'll all grow from it. But if someone lost a loved one, that's not a good thing. That's not something you want to hear, or you never know how it'll turn. I mean, you can go into all kinds of things. What doesn't kill us strengthens us, all that stuff. So, but that's what Job is getting at. That's what Job is getting, and what Kushner is getting at. Finally, Kushner says, I don't buy it. And that's what struck a chord. Again, during the AIDS period. Think of it. You needed to have someone say, no, these people didn't do anything wrong. They're not being punished. AIDS is not a punishment. And so he goes on to say that, forget those quick explanations. What's more important is to figure out how to respond to suffering than to figure out what caused it. That's an important message of this book. It's the meaning in suffering is in our response to it. If bad things happen due to bad luck, not by God or karma, then instead of raging at God, which is so natural, we shouldn't just dwell on our unluckiness either. We have to pick ourselves up and do something with our lives. We can never know why someone got a rare form of cancer and someone else didn't, or why a car skidded off a road. But and we want to do something, but we need to know that we're never going to find the reason. There doesn't have to be a knowable reason for all of these things. So we need to find a way to live our lives. And Archibald MacLeish wrote a play once called J.B., based on the book of Job. And at the end, there's a beautiful line, I'm trying to remember. It's something like, we can't understand all these things, but blow on the coal of your heart and we'll see by and by. If you blow on the coal of the heart, let the heart strengthen us. Let our love strengthen us, and we'll get the answers we're looking for, even if they're not the answers that we thought we would be able to find at the beginning. So here's a couple of quotes from Kushner's book. I no longer hold God responsible for illness, accidents, and natural disasters because I realize that I gain little and lose so much when I blame God for those things. Then he also wrote, the idea that suffering has no meaning is the most significant challenge that can be offered to the point of view that I have been advocating in this book. He says, now that this has happened to me, what am I going to do about it, is the question we need to answer. And he writes, there is a crucial difference between denying the tragedy, insisting that everything is for the best, the old Panglossian philosophy, the Candide philosophy, all is for the best in the best of all possible worlds. So there's a crucial difference between denying it and seeing the tragedy in the context of a whole life, keeping one's eye and mind on what has enriched you and not only on what you have lost. And that works in terms of our whole life. It also works in terms of the whole relationship. Let's say you lose a loved one. After the funeral, Shiva, takes place, and something very miraculous begins to occur. It's a real healing that takes place because people start telling stories that reach beyond the few months or years of that person's suffering, the final months of life, and go back maybe 20, 30, 40, maybe back to the beginning of life. And you see the book, you see the person's life as a whole book. And so you begin to see this little bit of suffering in the context of something much greater, and that we can actually be grateful for, despite the suffering. When a Jew dies, the traditional response, it's not just, the rabbi sending out an email Baruch Dayan Emet, that is supposed to be the traditional response. That's why I'm sending it out with that subject line for two reasons. One, so that you'll say that or think it, so you'll be doing Jewish tradition. And two, I don't want to scare everyone to death by putting the name of the person on the subject line, because it, you know, it's a shock enough as it is sometimes when you open them. So, and believe me, it's shocking to me, even though I write them. So anyway, Kushner's book really changed the dialogue, changed the discussion. And this is, again, not just for Jews, but for Christians too. Although there are many Christian circles that could not accept Kushner's philosophy. First of all, there's a whole different concept of heaven and hell and reward and punishment that's tied into Christian theology that Jews don't really have. It's not baggage that we have. We have concepts of heaven and hell and punishment and reward to some degree, but nothing like that. But also the whole notion of God's role in history. Kushner is basically saying, you know, this is the post-Holocaust philosophy that first really began to take hold at this point, you know, that point where we're like 40, 50 years after the Holocaust. God didn't do that. God didn't do Auschwitz. God cried with us in the gas chambers. It just takes everything and turns it on its head. And a lot of my teachers at JTS couldn't accept it, but they now had to teach it. And I, you know, I've struggled with a lot of this. I tend to sort of go along with a lot of Kushner's thinking, just because I think the alternative is unthinkable. It gets back to Yitz Greenberg. Remember we talked about, you know, the whole notion of can a theology stand up to the idea of children burning in the flame, being thrown into a flame? It can't. You know, so the Holocaust is always the trump card. But Kushner didn't really focus as much on the Holocaust. He focused on the Book of Job and on people's individual suffering, which I think was his genius, his brilliant. Instead of discussing, you know, I mean, this was pre 9/11, but a huge terror attack. No, he talked about someone's bout with cancer. And it brought it really down to a personal level. And, you know, again, I don't think he had marketing in mind, but you can just give so many books as gifts to victims of terror attacks. You know, God forbid, I really don't mean to make light of it. You can give this book to everyone who is suffering a death in the family or who is suffering an illness, who is going through cancer. And I gave it to many, and it inspired people and gave them strength. So, bestseller of all time, except the Bible. All right. Any questions about Kushner? I know I've given it a lot of time, but I felt really he deserves it. And if you haven't read the book, you can go on Amazon. It's probably in the top 10 even now. I don't know.
I had a question.
Go ahead.
And
Bye, Jonathan.
Michelle had her hand.
Oh, I'm sorry. It's Jeff. I didn't. Yeah, go ahead.
So she wants to go first.
Go ahead. I'm sorry. I didn't see the hand.
I was just going to say, I was reading this morning about an Amish family in Kentucky that with the tornadoes, and there was deaths, and the uncles commented that his niece and the children were now at peace together in heaven, whatever. And I just thought of reading Kushner. And then I thought of how for many people, I think, depending on what your faith background is, that there is consolation in the theology that Kushner stood on its head. You know what I'm saying? And that's not me. I mean, I'm for Kushner's approach, but sometimes when you look at people who find consolation in the other, the traditional, what might be called traditional Christian, I don't know, theology, it's just easier, at least for those who believe that.
Yeah, very good point. I think, you know, where Judaism would place the focus maybe a little more than Christianity, although not necessarily, is on the communal element of the consolation. Shiva being the perfect example of how we transform suffering through this magic of Shiva. We transform death back into life through ritual, and not even trying to explain. We don't have to get to these explanations. You can give them a book, but this is like, you can take this to the bank. Any of you ever become rabbis? When someone suffers a death in the family and is suffering, and they go to you and they say, why? They are not looking for an answer. Do not say, well, because. That's not what they're looking for. They're looking for a hug. And more than that, if they're looking for a because, they're looking for a much different kind of because. You don't have to be the one to answer. And when I sit with families before a funeral to talk about the person's life, I'll say, do you have any questions? And often our kids there. Some of you have experienced that. Sometimes there are young children even. And I'll say, I can't answer some of the questions that you have right now. But, if you're wondering why we shovel earth or what the coffin is, or those are the mysteries that, people, they want to take it one thing at a time, one step at a time. And that's what we do with Shiva. You start with a little bagel with a hole and you eat it. And then you sit down and then you start hugging people and you talk about the person who died. And that's the magic of it. Sharon and Jeff?
I was going to say that there is a part, I think, of most people that would like to think that there's a cause and effect to things and that there's a reason for everything. Obviously not the case. But the question I had was, you said when this book came out, it became part of the curriculum at the theological seminary, but what was the reaction to the book? Was it accepted right away, or was there resistance to it?
It's interesting. I was there when it came out. I think it was such a phenomenon, and everyone likes Harold Kushner. You can't not like him. I mean, he's been a mentor to me. So I think because he's so likable and so central, but there was I'm sure a lot of jealousy, because all these people have, been slaving away trying to get their message across. It's not even about being famous. It's just about suddenly, he hits the stratosphere. So I think there's a little of that, but and that might have translated into resisting his message, because the message, as I said, was radical. But I think we were ready for new answers. We just, it comes back to the Holocaust and to so many things that have happened in the last century that just don't fit into the neat boxes of our theology from 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago. And we've been struggling with theology and this question for a long time because Jews have suffered for a long time. But this is like a quantum leap. So, yeah, I think it's sort of a mixed response to Kushner within the movement, but generally very accepting of him, and for good reason. The book doesn't read like a scholarly book at all, which is another reason it's such a great seller. Brilliant. He made it understandable and made very complicated, controversial, even radical ideas seem like, sure, it just makes, he's a very reasoned thinker. He's not like spiritual in that sense, although I talked about this as a spiritual inward turning time for Jews, but he very much went on the rational side of that and tells a story. And his other books are that way too. He wrote several books subsequent to that, including a really good introduction to Judaism that I often use with conversion students, because it just makes it so understandable, and he sells it. I would buy this religion from him. If I weren't Jewish, I would buy it. So let me spend a few minutes on the other book that's part of this particular essay, because while I expect that the majority of American Jews have read Kushner, most haven't read this one. And let's see, I'll get it back up on the screen so you can see it. All right, so Rabbi Alan Liu, you can see here. He wrote a book in 2003 called "This is Real and You Are Completely Unprepared: The Days of Awe as a Journey of Transformation." So this has become a standard book, a standard bit of reading for congregants and for congregations and others, Jews outside of congregations, but in preparation for the high holidays. And again, like Kushner, he takes something that's very sort of accepted and middle of the road and gives it a radical twist, but not at all outside of tradition. He basically reminds us that Yom Kippur, Rosh Hashanah, this is not a fashion show. This is not a superficial just skimming of prayers that are not even comprehensible. But this is a life and death matter, even if you don't believe in God. So he, like Kushner, skirts the whole notion of God's responsibility. He takes what Kushner has as suffering, bad things happen to good people, and turns it on to the book of life itself. So here, I'll just read a little bit from the beginning. Yom Kippur is the day we all get to read our own obituary. Now that's the way to sell a book, don't you think? It's the first sentence. It's a dress rehearsal for our death. That's why we wear a kittel, a shroud-like garment. On this day, we refrain from life-affirming activities such as eating, drinking, and procreating. We are rehearsing the day of our death because death, like Yom Kippur, atones. Whew! And by the way, I would like to think that that's a message I try to send out every year, that that we need to take these high holidays seriously. Here's a little more. And here's the bad news I have come to deliver. This is a true story, and it is not about me or my mother or a man desperate to blow the shofar. It is about you. It is really happening. It is happening to you, and you are seriously unprepared. And it is real whether you believe in God or not. Perhaps God made it real, and perhaps God did not. Perhaps God created this pageant of judgment and choice, of transformation, of life and of death. Perhaps God created the book of life and the book of death, teshuvah and the blowing of the shofar. Or perhaps these are all just inventions of human culture. It makes no difference. It is equally real in any case. The weeks and the months and the years are also inventions of human culture. Time and biology are inventions of human culture. Language and stories, love and tragedy are inventions of human culture, but they are all matters of life and death, all real, all inescapable. Even though we invented the idea of weeks, we die when our allotted number of weeks has gone by. So if this event is merely the product of human culture, it is the product of an exceedingly rich culture, one that has been accumulating focus and force for 3,000 years. Okay, and you can hear the call of the wild maybe upstairs. One of my dogs is barking. But wow, I mean, he hits it home, so hard. We are all going to die. You don't need me to tell you that, but maybe we do. Maybe we need Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur to remind us. Maybe we need to be reminded every day, as our prayers really do, so that we'll take it very seriously, so that we'll, in the end, take every moment of life very seriously, so that if and when we do suffer and die, our lives we'll have been able to squeeze out the maximum amount of meaning from our lives. And it's a really important message. Rabbi Ginsburg used this book, I think, when he did a pre-high holiday course last year or the year before. And it's one that I really recommend that everyone read. I haven't focused on it as much because it came out, well beyond the midpoint, or I don't know how you're going to judge the length of my career, but at some point your thoughts are sort of, my high holiday routine was sort of in place, but this book was jarring enough to shake that routine, and I do recommend it for you. So here's the thing. and here's where it links to Kushner's book, and the essay, the commentary talks about this. Again, it's about an inwardly focused Judaism.
Yeah.
It's about a Judaism of spiritual seeking. It's about the search for meaning. Okay, let me show you from the commentary. It's on page 333 if you happen to have it. So I'll start the second paragraph. As a work of Jewish thought, Kushner's account of suffering is a popular, updated version of Maimonidean free will. As an artifact of late 20th century American spiritual life, the book offers a snapshot of the American Jewish search for meaning. Together with Alan Lew's This Is Real and You Are Completely Unprepared, it tells the story of a spiritual Judaism that is increasingly inwardly focused, serving to answer questions of meaning. And here's an interesting point, but lacking commitment to any entrenched Jewish community. The power of these books is that they open doors, they meet the reader in their moment of need and bring them along to a fuller place, but they also predict a Jewish life that is increasingly niche and tailored for the individual to undertake alone. So when I read that, I jumped back, and these books do share, along with others, many others, are authors like Art Green, Rabbi Arthur Green. Here's a book that you might remember if you had a bar mitzvah in the family in the 1980s. Jeffrey Salkin, who's still a columnist, great writer, Putting God on the Guest List. So it's how to reclaim the spiritual meaning of your child's bar or bat mitzvah. So it's saying we cannot take at face value the synagogue experience, the Jewish communal experience. We've trivialized it. We've made it so superficial. We should join synagogues. We should be committed to synagogues, but we should, within that commitment, try to find deeper meaning for our own lives. Ultimate goal is our own spiritual self-fulfillment. That sounds all hunky-dory, great. I mean, yeah, I certainly agree with that. But what is really the goal of sustaining a Jewish community? Is it for us personally to feel better, to feel more fulfilled? Or is it to sustain a Jewish community, to make sure that there is a synagogue that's thriving? Is it about the person or is it about the community? These are tensions that play themselves out and get into the whole question of peoplehood once again. Because the trend toward spiritual fulfillment, self-help, so many books about self-help, that trend is not necessarily in favor of the community or sustaining the community. It's all about me, back to the me generation. So anyone want to take me on here? Go ahead,
Yeah.
Jonathan.
There's a phrase that Lasden has, I think it's on 335, which really struck me, where he said, in effect, networked individualism, quote unquote, is not enough. And I think that, almost that it resonates really over the last few decades, that we've built some great social structures and made them virtual and so forth, but it's not enough.
So, here's where it sort of gets more interesting, because I think the dichotomy of community versus individual may not be putting it exactly the right way. The question is, do we gain fulfillment and meaning in life through self-fulfillment, or do we gain meaning through transcending the self? That it's not about me. Now, if it's not about me, what is it about? Well, one would say God, but here we've internalized God. I think that's a lot of what self-help does, and I go along with it. I see the God within, the God of love. Kushner's God is what is giving us the strength to overcome our suffering or to help another overcome it. But there's something that needs to transcend us too, that needs to be bigger than us. And that's where community comes in. That's where tapping into Jewish history that will come after us, thousands and thousands of years, we hope, definitely centuries. There will be Jews after we die, which is a great source of comfort and meaning. That is immortality for the Jew. That it's not about heaven as much. It's really about the Jewish people continuing on. That's why intermarriage is such an issue for so many people. We want to make sure the grandchildren have a Jewish connection. It's really important. So that's our immortality sort of at stake here. But it's also going into the past, the connections to the past and to the Jewish people and to the land of Israel and to the state of Israel now. I mean, all of that. And so I'm wondering, Kushner transcends the Jewish community in his way by reaching out to non-Jews and by selling lots of books and reaching into that which is most human about us and answering fundamental questions. And Lou transcends the collective congregational experience of the high holidays, which I think is very powerful. When that Torah comes out, you might remember from 2 years ago, or even last year for some of you, the Torah comes out and what goes around the sanctuary, and we all make contact with the same Torah, and we all come up to the ark at the end, and that's such a powerful group experience, and people cry. Or is it more about, I need to worry about my own life because I'm going to die? So my answer is, is the high holidays experience primarily communal or individual? Both. And that's what makes it so incredible, so powerful. But what Lou and Kushner have reminded us and brought back into a long-standing Jewish dialogue is that personal fulfillment, self-help, personal meaning wasn't just invented by the the whole earth catalog or by Chicken Soup for the Soul. It was invented a long time ago, and it does need to be taken seriously. So that's like the fundamental question of all the questions for that essay. So we're not going to get to the other essays, but I do want to leave with one other question, and if anyone has any other points you want to make, okay. So Lou claims that by the way, he died tragically in 2009, I believe. He was very young. It rocked the conservative Jewish world. He was a conservative rabbi, although he seems to be so new agey and renewal. The conservative movement has room for everybody, and he was very successful pulpit rabbi in San Francisco for a number of years. And I went to a few retreats where he did yoga sessions, and I'm just not that good at it. But I tried. We have other people who have brought yoga to our community. I outsource it. But anyway, he was great, though. He was really inspiring. But then he died, sadly. And so the message from him, it's almost like Larson, from Rent. Have you seen the movie Tick, Tick, Boom that just came out? Anyway, someone who is delivering his message, and the message is so much about life and death, and then for him to tragically die so young. But he's saying, are we really living in a dream? Are we really understanding that we are not going to live forever? And the high holidays remind us of these existential realities and how important they are. It's like that scene in Our Town where Emily is up in the mountain, on the hill, the cemetery, and she's sort of calling out from the dead, saying, really, live every day as of your life. So the question that I would have is, if he had lived, if he and Kushner had both lived through 9/11, anniversary today of Sandy Hook, 2020 of COVID, has our world changed? Have we changed through those experiences, those near-death experiences, those ultimately sad, tragic experiences of communal suffering as well as individual suffering? Would they be saying anything different now? That wasn't one of those like easy questions to leave you on. But I'm not sure I have an answer to that, except I do believe that when we finally get out of this COVID mess, and it's not close. I just heard today of 4 people who are within the congregational orbit who tested positive, like, not maybe children of congregants, etc., who have it. You know, it's really out there. I cannot tell you. It is not going away right now. It's getting worse, and they live in this area, New York, tri-state area. So we're not there yet, but when we do get there, and I think already it has changed us. I mean, it's changed us in some good ways and some not so good ways, but I think we are much more acutely aware of our mortality on a daily basis than we ever have been. And, so would Kushner then say that this gives meaning to our suffering, that it helps us to deal with mortality and to live life in a more, intense, acknowledging way and grateful for what we have? I don't know. We could actually ask Harold Kushner that question, but I don't think I want to bother him right now with that. Yes, Jeff.
Well, I think the pandemic has sort of heightened everything, sort of individual self-awareness and in order to survive this, and also the sense of community and how much you miss it and how important it is. So it certainly has had an impact. It hasn't been fun living through it, but I think the impact has been positive in some ways.
Yeah, no, I can understand what you're saying. I think it's enriched our lives, even as it has diminished them. It's given a lot more meaning to the work I do, to the things that we're all doing and sharing. I mean, every day when we have a minion online, we never celebrated getting minions at 7:30 in the morning the way we celebrate them now. So, I even like seeing Susan's dog in the photo that she has up. Anyway, it's been good
That's
to see
his
everybody.
dazed and confused look.
That's the confused look. Okay.
Dazed and confused look.
Judy wrote, I am more aware of my surroundings and feel compelled to avoid crowds. Absolutely. I think we all feel that way. We're all very conscious of the people around us. For sure. So, thank you all. So for next time, I definitely want to talk about Blue Greenberg. Not a lot, but I think it's worth reading that. And Paul Cowan and Rachel Cowan, also interesting. A little dated, but still important as a stepping stone in terms of our understanding interfaith families. Blue Greenberg, though, is interesting because she's an Orthodox pioneer, an Orthodox woman, the wife of Yitz Greenberg, who she predicted that there would be Orthodox rabbis within 50 years of when she wrote her book. And she's sort of right. I mean, no one could have imagined that. Well, we talked about Lady Cotton Pogrebin and feminism from a more progressive point of view, but Blue Greenberg gives us the Orthodox point of view, and that'll be worth talking about. And I'll throw in another something else that I'll send you over the course of the next few weeks. But meanwhile, have a wonderful little break from this class, and good holidays, and stay safe, stay well, and great to see everybody. And of course, be in touch. And we have services. We got things going on, so join us.
Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you,
care.
Rabbi.
Bye, everybody.
Bye. Thank
Thank you.
you. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.